Today on Histories Tech, we are looking at an incredibly revolutionary piece of technology that's going to spawn an entire class of ships and even have its own line of succession based on its initial design. That's right, today we're looking at the USS Monitor. This mid 18th century ship is the culmination of multiple types of technology being developed during the 1800s, all coming together on a single platform. And while the Monitor itself had a relatively short career, all of the ships that it sponsored and even the class of ships it sponsored would go on to live into the next century. But let's go ahead and look at the history and development of the USS Monitor and its subsequent ships. Now, I have previously talked about ironclad ships, so I won't be spending as much time on the development of that, but I do want to talk about this. The Paxton guns was a revolutionary piece of technology developed during the 1820s. And what's so important about it is this is the first naval gun designed to specifically fire explosive shells. And in an age when ships are pretty much always made out of wood, this was a devastating piece of technology. With this, even the smallest of navies now had a way to take out much more powerful, larger ships. So the counterpoint to this was the development of the ironclad warship. And with the development of the French ironclad Glory, the age of the ironclad had come and the age of the wooden ship was on its way completely out. And from here, we see navies around the world each developing their own ironclads. Now, countries like the United States were actually slow to develop their ironclads, like this, the Stevens Battery, mainly because of the fact that even though they started developing it in 1941, they went through problem after problem. The designer died. They had construction delays. Eventually, the American Civil War happened and delayed the construction to the point where by the time they were able to build it, it just cost too much money and they abandoned it. And they had already built the Monitor. Versus the British, who actually ended up developing their first ironclad, the HMS Warrior. And designs like the HMS Warrior pretty much became the standard for the ironclad warship. They looked very much like a traditional wooden hulled ship, except they were now clad in iron, and they used steam for propulsion. However, the Monitor is going to be the radical move away from this, and it's actually going to start with this ship right here. The USS Merrimack was built as a steam frigate. Essentially, these were smaller corvettes or gunboats that were not designed to be frontline ships, but kind of support vessels. And what ends up happening is the Merrimack is burned and sunk in dock on April 20th, 1861, in order to prevent her capture by the newly christened Confederacy. And this was basically a sabotage maneuver by the Union Navy to prevent it from falling into enemy hands. However, with the Confederacy being relatively new, they needed a ship. And so they decided to go ahead and raise the Merrimack, and they'll rebuild her as an ironclad ram, known as the CSS Virginia. Now, the Virginia was built as what's known as a casemate ironclad. And basically, unlike the Monitor class, which keeps their main guns in a separate armored gun turret, the casemate has theirs in a slope structure instead. Now, in response to the Confederacy building an ironclad warship, the Union goes ahead and gives approval in August of 1861 to build their own. And they enlist the work of this man, John Ericsson, who's actually a Swedish American engineer. And his involvement was not that you might think. He didn't come in there trying to pitch this idea for this new ship. Instead, he was brought in to help a friend of his, Cornelius Bushnell, with his own ironclad ship. And the design was very skeptical. There was a lot of issues on whether it float or not because of how heavy it was. So Ericsson decided to propose his own design. And the Navy was very skeptical about it. This new design was extremely unconventional, with its very low freeboard, meaning that it was very low to the water, a shallow draft with an iron hull, this independent steam propulsion system inside of it, and then to have an untested rotating gun turret, which had never been really utilized by any Navy before. And so after some skepticism, they went ahead and went with this revolutionary design, even though there was a lot of risk involved in it. Now, of course, this design would become the ever-famous USS Monitor. Interestingly enough, it had quite a few nicknames during its development. Ericsson's Folly, Cheese Box on a Raft, the Yankee Cheese Box. And the uniqueness of this ship meant that it had problems. Because of its size, the low freeboard and things like that, A series of fans had to be built into it to circulate air, not only for the crew, but also for the boilers themselves. And the leather belts used to power them from the boilers to the blower fans actually stretched when they were wet, which would disable the fans in the boilers. Another issue was that the turret was actually almost impossible to turn back once it made a rotation. So it was just easier to keep the rotation going if they needed to retrain its elevation and its location. And it took a full 22 and a half seconds to completely rotate the turret. Also, the turret leaked. Due to the low freeboard, water very easily washed over the deck of the ship, and there was supposed to be a copper ring to prevent this water from getting through, but it never worked, and water could get into the ship very easily, a problem for it later on. Even with all these problems, the ship was deployed for its ever famous confrontation with the CSS Virginia at the Battle of Hampton Roads. Now, while we have these two ironclads going toe to toe, the inevitable battle is going to be a draw. The Monitor did successfully defend a Union blockade. The Virginia was able to complete its destruction of the ships that had been attacking earlier and escape. However, strategically, nothing changed in terms of the war, other than the fact that this is going to boost the Navy to want more ironclad warships. And this is where we're going to see this big boost in the Monitors and other ironclad casemate ironclads. Now, after the Battle of Hampton Roads, both sides really began devising how to defeat each other's ironclad warships. And this begins this big plan of what's the other's weakness? How do you defeat an ironclad? What are you going to do? Are you going to try and capture it? Are you going to try to build better weapons? Maybe you ram it. And so each side tried to come up with ways of luring the other ship into a trap, essentially. Now, there was a second confrontation between the two ships on May 8th. Basically, the Monitor and some other ships were attacking Confederate batteries. The Virginia came out to defend them. And it was rather limited exchange. The Confederacy wasn't going to allow the Virginia to be lured into a trap. And basically, this is the last time the two will ever come close to encountering each other. On May 11th, the Confederate forces abandoned Norfolk and destroyed the Virginia in the process to prevent it from being captured. And while that's the end of the story for the Virginia, the Monitors continues for a while longer. It's going to take place in a battle known as the Battle of Drury's Bluff, or afterwards it'll actually be put in for repairs and in a refit. And this, of course, all leads to the final voyage of the Monitor on December 24th, 1862. The Monitor was ordered to head for Beaufort, North Carolina to join the USS Passaic and the USS Montauk as part of a joint Army-Navy expedition against Wilmington. And the problem was this was not great weather. We've talked about that its low freeboard made it really close to the waterline. The water began to really swell. It was really bad seas. She began to take on so much water that her pumps couldn't really help with it, and eventually she would sink. But that's not the end of the story of the Monitor. As I stated, with the Battle of Hampton Roads, this Monitor fever started to spread in the North, and there was a want for more Monitors. And so it wasn't much longer that a new design for a Monitor was permitted. The first of these, the Passaic class, was basically a USS Monitor improved. They took the design of the USS Monitor and they made several improvements. They moved the pilot house to on top of the turret. They actually enlarged the ship. They actually redesigned the overall hull for a rounder design. And so all of these improvements actually made it a very much a better design, much more efficient version of the USS Monitor. 10 of these ships were actually ordered, and they were actually finished before the end of the war, and the last one served until 1899. And the design was actually deemed so successful it actually be copied by the Imperial Russian Navy. And this design is, of course, followed by another improved design, the Conicus class, also known as the Tippecanoe. Once again, the design was enlarged. It was designed to be faster, actually carried larger guns, and a slightly faster turret. And they too had a relatively long-lived career. They actually managed to be involved in the Spanish-American War, retiring in 1899, and a few of the ships were actually sold to the Peruvian Navy. Now, the last class of Monitor descendants to actually be a part of the American Civil War is going to be the Mindanao class Monitors. This was a series of 4 Monitors built really towards the end of the war, started construction in 1862, but only one of them was completed by the end of the war. This was one of the more unusual succeeding classes of the USS Monitor, as it carried dual turrets on it. Each of the turrets had its own pilot house. Additionally, its hull was not iron, it was wood, was just wood instead of being iron. And this was kind of to help with the weight of the overall vessel. And they had an incredibly short career, all being scrapped by the 1870s. Now, the final of the direct descendants of the USS Monitor is a ship known as the USS Dictator, originally known as the Protector. This ship, at 312 feet, was nearly twice the length of the USS Monitor, but its design went back to John Ericsson's original Monitor design, just on a much larger scale. And this was supposed to be an improved monitor designed for much longer range and even capable of long distance across the ocean. However, it was a very problematic vessel and also had a short lived career, being scrapped in the 1880s. And that would be it pretty much for monitor type vessels as a descent of the USS Monitor. Mainly because by the 1880s, the world had shifted away from casemate ironclads and the Monitor style ironclads to go to this, the armored cruiser, the precursor to the battleship. Now, the Monitor's legacy doesn't end there. It obviously influenced the entire Monitor class ships that were popular around the world, and it was rediscovered in the 1970s, where multiple attempts were made to actually raise the entire vessel for preservation. While they couldn't do that, they were able to preserve the turret, which is available for view at Mariner's Museum, where you can see more than just the turret. You can see the guns, engine components, and several other pieces of the Monitor, including artifacts. And in Newport News, there is actually a full-scale, non-seaworthy static replica of the Monitor you can visit as well. But there you have it, a look at the USS Monitor, the classes that followed it, a rather unique ship that gave birth to a series of other ships and an entire class that was globally famous. And while it itself didn't have a very long career, it had a lasting effect on navies around the world. But that's it for today. Thank you for joining me, and I look forward to talking to you on the next time.